My name is Ephraim Mohome, and I'm the one moderating this particular presentation. The presenter today is Mr. Gilbert Wafula, who is a lecturer in the Department of History and Archaeology, University of Nairobi. He holds a BA degree in archaeology from the University of Nairobi and an MA from the University of London, UCL Institute of Archaeology. In his presentation, Mr. Wafula addresses the question of how archaeological and heritage resources in Kenya can be useful in addressing present social and economic challenges. He argues that despite numerous obstacles, archaeology and its associated cultural heritage resources have the potential to serve the public good. He advocates a value-based heritage conservation approach in the exploitation of archaeological resources. He's currently working with communities along the coast on the same issues. I wish to present Mr. Wafula to you this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Home, for that introduction. Happy New Year. I want to thank everybody, each one of you, for having taken your time to come and listen to me. I don't take it for granted, I appreciate. This is work which is in the preliminary stages. It is not much developed. Therefore, I will appreciate your contributions and your corrections. It will be very much welcome. The title of the talk is The Value of Archaeological Heritage in Kenya Today, Challenges and Opportunities. I will begin by defining a few terms which may not be familiar to some of you. Then I'll talk a bit about the theories which may apply to this discipline or which I'm using so far. Then I'll give the introduction. I'll talk a bit about the thesis statement, talk about the problem, and give a background. I'll also talk about opportunities, challenges, and conclude. So beginning with the definitions, heritage. Not everybody is familiar with it. Here, I use the definition of heritage provided by sorry, just a little bit, please. By Timothy Dillon, defines heritage as what we inherit from the present and use it in the present day. Simply stated, history is the past, whereas heritage is the modern day use of that past for tourism and other purposes. For example, education and community development. Of course, archaeological heritage is part of heritage, but focusing on heritage. And here, when I talk about archaeological heritage, I'll be talking about all remains and objects and any other traces of humankind from past times. These shall include structures, constructions, groups of buildings, developed sites, movable objects, monuments of other kinds, as well as their context, whether situated on land or underwater. I will also talk about stakeholders. Then I take stakeholders. These are the people who relate with the archaeological heritage. These will be archaeologists, professional archaeologists, the general public, local people. This will be indigenous or local communities, Other important stakeholders will be museum visitors, museum officials, volunteers, donors, community partners, tourism, business people, etc. All these are stakeholders. They have an interest in archaeological heritage. The theories, I'm not very, at this point, I'm not really very much concerned with theories because I will develop the theories when I gather enough data. Nevertheless, so far, I'm using critical theory. Critical theory denotes any approach to social philosophy that focuses on society and culture to reveal, criticize, and challenge power structures. It has roots in sociology and literary criticism, and it argues that social problems stem more from social structures and cultural assumptions than from individuals. Then the critical archaeology questions the relationship between archaeological objects, like archaeological sites, social relations, and the meanings by historizing the process of history and meaning making. It challenges its immutability or offering or illuminating alternatives. Critical approaches to public archaeology have been in use since the 1980s. However, it is only in the recent past that archaeologists have started using critical theory in conjunction with public archaeology in order to challenge dominant narratives of the past. When we talk about museums, we'll use critical theory. Critical theory engages critically with the museums. It questions the foundation assumptions of the field. Then there's the practical museology, which considers what the role of the public and the experience of audiences means to everyday work of a museum. Finally, there's post-colonial theory in archaeology. A main purpose of this theory is to identify and explore alternative histories, including that of voiceless or subaltern agency. Of course, the term subaltern in this project refers to the lower social groups displaced to the margins of society. And these are the people I'm really concerned with. In particular, these are ordinary citizens and local communities who have, in the history of archaeology, had a raw deal. Now I go to the introduction. When one talks about resources in Kenya and their benefits to society, what usually comes to mind is the image of our world-conquering athletes, or what comes to mind would be our sandy beaches at the coast, or our wildlife. So that you talk about the big five and so on. We all know that this brings a lot of money through tourism. What many people in Kenya do not know, however, or what they fail to appreciate, is that Kenya also possesses plenty of archaeological, paleontological, and associated cultural resources, which we can also use to bring benefits to Kenya. This country is renowned world over for its rich fossil and archaeological record, which depict the country as a leading candidate for the source of human beings. That's why it's sometimes called the cradle of humankind. The country has perhaps the richest prehistoric fossil heritage anywhere in the world that dates over 100 million years ago, the time when the dinosaurs ruled the planet Earth. Many of the archaeological and paleontological sites found in Kenya depict the various stages of the development and evolution of early humans. There are also many other later prehistoric sites all over the country representing the past inhabitants of Kenya. So we talk about human beings. Kenya is the home of all human beings, and therefore it's very important in terms of heritage. These archaeological and related cultural heritage resources can be exploited in a manner that benefits, or in a manner that benefits or helps to address some of the main challenges facing ordinary Kenyans. Why is this topic important? The role of archaeology in society is one of the main, or one of the topical issues in archaeology today. So in this paper, I address the question of the value of archaeological and related heritage resources in helping to address contemporary social and economic challenges facing Kenya today, a context of economic hardship and social inequality, where ordinary citizens are suffering, while a few elites, like ourselves, professional archaeologists, reap maximum benefits of these resources. It is ironical that a country so much endowed with abundant heritage resources has majority of its citizens languishing in abject poverty. Like many other disciplines, archaeology has been challenged to help provide solutions to the social economic challenges facing contemporary society. In the recent past, an increasing number of archaeologists have conducted research that is explicitly designed to address contemporary issues that affect society. This paper is a step in that direction. Although the traditional focus of archaeology of establishing scientific truth is valuable, it is unlikely to expand its practical relevance in the present circumstances, like those facing Kenyans today, ordinary Kenyans, that is. This preliminary research is based on my belief that the application of academic knowledge and skills should not be an end in itself, but a way of providing social justice to disadvantaged members of society. I also believe that if the correct approach is applied, archaeology and cultural heritage resources have the potential to serve the public good for the benefit of both the ordinary citizens of Kenya and the world at large. I also believe in research work that promotes the stewardship of the archaeological heritage resources in our country in order to ensure that they are not only benefiting those living today, but also for the future generations. So let me talk about the thesis of this paper. Although Kenya possesses numerous archaeological heritage resources that should play a significant role in responding to the needs of members of society in respective localities, owing to the traditional systemic practices of archaeology in this country, which were largely inherited from the colonial past that tend to focus on serving the interests of elites, common people who are mostly the underprivileged members of society are not adequately benefiting from them. In order to motivate sustainable heritage conservation efforts, especially among local communities and the general public, who are the people in constant interaction with these resources should be of tangible value to them, one that makes a difference in their daily lives. In this paper, I argue that despite numerous obstacles, the discipline of archaeology and associated cultural heritage resources should serve the public good for the benefit of all citizens of Kenya, irrespective of their social and economic status, besides serving the people of the world at large, as it should. I will end by advocating for a values-based heritage conservation approach to the exploitation of archaeological resources. Now let me talk about a little bit about the main problem, main issue. In an ideal or perfect world, the way things should be, the academic discipline of archaeology is not limited to its traditional role of producing scientific knowledge for our human past, if all things were okay. This point has been emphasized by several archaeologists, including Professor Karega Munene, Peter Smith, Daryl Stam. Archaeologists like Paul Lane have argued that archaeology has an obligation to play a greater role in responding to the needs of the societies in which they work. A critical archaeology argues that archaeology must be made practically relevant to the present and must not remain merely an arcane discourse of the past. That's according to Tilly. An Indian archaeologist known as Virasamy Selvakumar also supports this idea. According to him, archaeologists need to focus on the developmental potential and the social relevance of their subjects for the benefit of the community. Looking at the situation on the ground, now forget about what we expect, but looking at the situation on the ground in the whole continent of Africa, for instance, Zimbabwean archaeologist known as Innocent Pikirai argues that the main crisis in African archaeology lies in the perception among its practitioners, and of course some doubting Thomases, that it is just a science of investigating the past with no bearing on the present. However, contrary to this, archaeology has a role in addressing social and economic issues such as racism, poverty, development, equity, and social justice. It has a role. In Kenya today, rampant with poverty, illiteracy, disease, and heritage destruction among majority of its citizens, the general public and local communities who are facing these problems, optimistic archaeologists see a greater role for archaeology. This is through addressing ethical concerns, such as the creation of not only public awareness on human rights issues, which people like Professor Wahome has addressed in his publications, but also the application of methods and the creation of data that ensures that public benefits are accrued. The situation on the ground in Kenya, insofar as this question is concerned, especially contribution to the betterment of ordinary people's lives, is not yet clear, so it needs investigation. There is rampant poverty and inequality in Kenya today. That one is clear. In a hostile environment, the common person in Kenya is suffering, yet we have plenty of resources. Some of these people live next to the sites. I remember Dr. Nyanjoga, you presented us a paper in Nyamira County showing us some of these sites. Although most of them were not archaeological, but you could see that there were some people who are living close to them, yet they are not benefiting. The ordinary Kenyan and local communities do not see the benefits of archaeological sites in their vicinity. Preliminary investigations of this work show that the distress, the common or the ordinary person faces today in Kenya is amazing. What an average person is talking about now is how to make ends meet. Even if you tell them that this site is very important for us archaeologists, that Kenya it makes Kenya an important nation in the world. They will ask you, do I eat that fame? What do I benefit when I hear that Kenya is the leader, the origin of humankind? So the average Kenyan is more concerned about their daily livelihoods. The Swahili coastal region is perhaps one of the best examples of places endowed with numerous of such resources, but which only benefit a few privileged people, such as employees in museums, such as those close to, such as those with businesses, and so on. But majority of the people languish in poverty. It is immoral for archaeologists to ignore the prevailing and favorable economic climate in their working environments. Archaeological resources should benefit all, not just a select few professional archaeologists, museum officials, political leaders, and the like. So, following from that, talking about aims, an important question is how archaeologists, as archaeologists, we can use material culture, sites, objects, and the like to understand subaltern agency better, cultural appropriation, and colonial entanglement. Some of these are the challenges that the people of Kenya have faced over time. So the research aims to investigate how archaeology and its main contribution, cultural heritage, can positively contribute to social good, far beyond the traditional role of understanding the past and physically preserving cultural remains. It is argued in this study that the archaeological heritage can and should be used to improve the daily livelihoods of members of society. Now, let me talk a bit about the background. Here, I'll begin by talking a bit about the traditional approach and what benefit it has brought and the weaknesses of the traditional approach. Then later on, I'll look at what happened so that that traditional approach has been abandoned, and now we have a new approach. The practice of archaeology in Kenya can be traced back to the colonial period, starting with archaeology in museums. We can say that the colonial museum in Kenya played an important role, especially in terms of its core function or its traditional function, that one of collecting, preserving, interpreting, and displaying objects of artistic, cultural, or scientific significance. The colonial museum in Kenya has, however, been criticized, just like colonial museums elsewhere in Africa. Some of these criticisms are that they tended to focus more on their collections, i.e. artifacts such as stone tools, ceramics, metals, rather than on the people or the audience. Interest was on the tools themselves or the objects, not the people. Another criticism of colonial museum is that although these core functions are important, it's just the same. Although these core functions are important, the beneficiaries were a few elites. And these were professional archaeologists who analyze those materials. They are funders, mostly colonial government officials, who needed these kinds of researches so that they could address their political issues, especially to rule over Africans. As for relationship with the museum visitors was concerned, museum officials in the colonial period treated common people in a patronizing know-it-all attitude or manner. And this was through inculcation, instruction, and induction, instead of, like today is the case, discussion and exchange of ideas. Another criticism is that not only were museums, colonial museums used, not only were they used to control, or not only were they used by the elites, members of society, to control ordinary people. They were also used as instruments of subjugating common people who were limited to playing a passive and minimal role in the museum's affairs. In such a setting, ordinary citizens tended to be forgotten, ignored, or neglected. In such a situation, ordinary people normally have no voice, no role to play at all. There's no subaltern agency. The interests of the common person were instead frustrated through vandalism and looting of their cultural heritage. So many of these archaeological resources, for example, were stolen from Kenya and taken to foreign countries. Local people were never consulted as this was happening. What about research, archaeological research in the colonial times? Kenya has had a long history of archaeological research, which has contributed a lot to the refinement of field methodology and archaeological interpretation of the past. Colonial researchers, who mainly comprised individuals in the service of the colonial governments, collected stone tools. Sometimes they analyzed them in the lab. They surveyed archaeological sites and used normative archaeology to come up with cultural stratigraphic frameworks that are still relevant today. So, give the devil his due. These colonial researches formed the foundation of archaeology, not only in Kenya, but in East Africa. The Leakeys, LSB Leakey and Mary Leakey, clearly stand out for their outstanding role in laying the foundation of archaeology in Kenya and the larger East African region, both in the aspects of human origins and particularly in later prehistory. So that is on the positive side of archaeological research in the colonial period. But what can we say about the negativities? The practice of archaeology in the colonial period is characterized by war, because during the colonial period, some people are still resisting one way or another against against colonization. Vandalism, as I mentioned a bit earlier, looting of treasures, and these were taken from stolen from Africa and taken to the homes of colonial powers. Colonial archaeology was as well characterized by an imperialist mentality. By this, I mean patronizing treatment of the indigenous people and local communities, and even racism. For example, perceptions of archaeologists as being white, while the actual workers digging in the excavations were dark-skinned, indigenous, common people. These people are exploited by being underpaid, while their heritage was being robbed. The main problem with colonial archaeology in Kenya, both in the museum and in academia, however, is that archaeology and heritage management revolved around class. That's what I feel. The discipline was tailored to serve the interests of a few elites, the creme de la creme of society. This was against the interests of the common people. In this way, vulnerable members of society were alienated, denied, or restricted in their right to benefit from heritage resources. Although Kenya attained its independence from the colonial rule in 1963, many of the colonial practices in the discipline continued unabated. from the 1970s to about 2000, processual and post-processual approaches dominated archaeological thinking in archaeological research in Africa generally and in Kenya. These two main approaches had strengths. Their main strengths were their attempts to move towards interdisciplinary research, so that we now see archaeologists working with anthropologists using methods such as ethnoarchaeology. So interdisciplinary research was encouraged. Through processual archaeology, communication beyond archaeology became possible. And this was a plus for the two approaches. However, these two approaches are criticized for having several weaknesses, which impacts the exploitation of cultural heritage resources in Kenya. These two approaches are criticized for having several weaknesses. These are, for example, their theories were too generalizing to archaeology, especially for Africa, thereby lacking locally based epistemologies and worldviews. So they were mostly Western-based theories. They suited the Western societies than the African context. So that is a criticism. There are little, if any, application of memory, for example, in writing African settings is a weakness, yet memory is an integral part of African history making. So they ignored memory, yet in Africa, memory is very important when you are writing history. Then the little attachment placed on communicating the relevance of archaeology to non-professionals to ensure its survival as a discipline was also a weakness, because the relevance of archaeology to non-professionals was not emphasized by those two approaches. Although archaeology and heritage management generally are important in helping us to learn about past cultures, there are many things wrong with the traditional setup in general. Although archaeology is important in helping us to learn about past cultures, for example, museums used solely to serve class interests. For example, in Kenya and Africa, generally, they were used to perpetuate colonial ideology. Some of you, colleagues of mine, you remember about the myth of the superiority of foreigners against the majority of locals, in order to justify the notion that indigenous cultures were inferior. Universities emphasized a lot on scientific truth. This is important, but universities throughout the world, and especially those in Africa in particular, are criticized for being literally ivory towers, aloof, unaccountable, and disengaged from the interests of their communities. Some people continue to argue that disciplines like archaeology and history should just focus on offering scientific truth. But this idea is now criticized as being elitist and non-inclusivity in nature. Now, that is the traditional system. It was not okay. I pointed out its weaknesses. Now, let's look at modern approaches. At the dawn of this millennium, sometime in the 1990s, as the Cold War came to an end, We began to see an upsurge in the process of globalization. This was accompanied by rapid social change, serious global economic volatility. In tourism, we see a lot of increases in tourism activities associated with the massive technological innovations. What was the impact of this for us archaeologists? There was a paradigm shift world over in archaeology and heritage management. New approaches in the management of archaeological sites and landscapes, which were adopted since then, are a response to these conditions. This development has happened in light of the complexity of today's social environment, like the one I described earlier, of the pathetic situation of the common Kenyan in terms of socioeconomic affairs. This is also in light of the wide range of values and rights involved in heritage decision-making and the scientific, technological, and traditional ways of documenting and sustaining heritage. In that line, let me talk a bit about the Kenya. Several efforts have been made in various parts of the world to attain a people-centered museum. These include the establishment of museums with the leanings towards a visitor-focused approach. So this is in opposition to the colonial approach. This is to align with the new developments. Other emphases include museums playing a role that is adjustable to the public's needs, an emphasis that museum officials play a basically technical support role, a shift or reformulation of paradigms, the use of lessons learned from previous visitors' responses, and the construction of healthy human communities. Signs that the people-centered museums has arrived include use of a people-friendly museum by museum officials in their communication with the public. You remember when Tabitha was here talking about public education, she told us how museum officials are using this kind of approach to educate archaeology to school children. It also involves reformulation of paradigms and or the adoption of new models popular with the people, and the adoption of the meaning-making model that encourages museum visitors to develop interactive relationships with other visitors and the museums for more meaningful interpretations of museum exhibits. Some of the new approaches have gone to the extent of embracing activism. For example, a lady known as Carol Dixon, in her article, which she published this year, Transforming Museums, it's entitled Transforming Museums, Decolonizing Minds. She examines forms of activism in which artistic expressions, may I repeat? She examines forms of activism in which artistic expression features as a means of raising awareness and catalyzing progressive change on matters of equality, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. So these are the things people are fighting for nowadays, and they can even use activism. And this is in the museum. In recent years, museums have adopted, to reach the people that museums nowadays are also using new technologies to reach a wider public and to educate the public, hoping that even the common person will be able to use these channels, but I doubt. For example, internet, digitization. Many people cannot afford this, but it is a way in which archaeology can become more accessible. How much more, many more people can access our heritage resources so that other people also enjoy resources. So that is the background. But now, still the new approaches, let me talk about the value-based heritage conservation approach. Values-based heritage conservation aims to retain the cultural significance of places, typically by balancing the aesthetic, historic, scientific, spiritual, and social values held by past, present, and future generations. The advantage of this approach is that all stakeholders at least stand to benefit, so that it does not focus on elites, or it does not focus on the low class people, but all stand to benefit. This approach comprises 7 basic steps. The first 2, which relate directly to the work of us archaeologists. The first step of the values-based heritage conservation approach is to understand the place where the heritage resources are. Here you define the place, if it's a landscape, and the extent of that place. You also investigate this place in terms of its history, the people living there, its uses, and so on. The second step, which also as archaeologists can do, is to assess the cultural significance of the place. For us now, to assess, not only to identify resources, but to assess their significance, their value. Here you assess all the values using relevant criteria. You also develop a statement of significance. The steps 3, 4, and 5 relate to developing policy. I don't know if I need to mention this. Steps 6 and 7 deal with managing. Anyway, steps 3, 4, and 5 relate to developing policy. 3, you identify all factors and issues. Here you identify obligations arising from significance and the future needs and resources, opportunities and constraints. It also involves developing policy and preparing management plan. I think this can be done by the museums. This is an administrative issue. Steps 6 and 7 deal with managing according to policy, and this will involve implementing the management plan. While 8 is about monitoring the results and review plan. So that is the value-based approach. Related to the value-based approach, or as part of the value-based approach, you can also talk about it as being an all-inclusive approach. And this is presently being advocated by a scholar known as Mike Mrowski. Mrowski proposes an all-inclusive approach, one that embraces a human-centered mindset in museums, asks us to advance empathy, human potential, and collecting well-being as integral elements in the museum's values and culture. This is about putting people, not just visitors, at the center of our organizational thinking. These people include various stakeholders, such as visitors, as well as staff, volunteers, members, donors, etc. In the Kenya of today, we have a citizenry that is more politically empowered and more knowledgeable about their rights on issues of social justice than was the case in the colonial times or during the 1960s or 1970s. Today, things have changed. Kenyans now are empowered. The reason set up in Kenya is well manifested in the 2010 people-centered constitution. For example, we have a rich Bill of Rights, which guarantees rights and freedoms of all Kenyans. It guarantees citizens against discrimination in any form. So even discriminating ordinary people not to enjoy heritage is a form of discrimination, and our constitution is against it. So it guarantees citizens against discrimination in any form, whether directly or indirectly, against any person on any ground. According to our constitution, the state shall not discriminate directly. I've said that. The most important ingredients in the 2010 constitution include declaration of the sovereignty of the people, so that all Kenyans, all people are important. All people have a right to enjoy. This is a constitutional right. There's also an important ingredient in the Constitution of Kenya, which deals with provisions for the decentralization of power or devolution. This relates to devolution of powers to the local levels. Now we have county governments, for example. This was not there in the past, but with the new constitution, we have it. So people at the local levels should now, in fact, have a better chance of enjoying their resources because of this decentralization. Then there's the recognition in the constitution of the need for improved access to basic needs for vulnerable members of society. So they should have basic needs. And if archaeology can help to do that, why not? The Constitution also provides a rich Bill of Rights that gives fundamental rights and freedoms for its citizens. Though by no means perfect, this document has aroused the following among ordinary people of Kenya. It has aroused interest. People asking themselves about poverty, the challenges they are facing today. Why are we poor? Are we supposed to, is it okay for us to continue being poor while some people are rich, they're enjoying their resources? The question of inequality. Is it okay for us to continue being, some people are being sidelined? The issue of non-inclusivity, alienation by those wielding political power and other elites, professionals in museums, in academia, entrepreneurships, sidelining those not in a position. So the situation in Kenya now is exasperated, one of desperation resulting from issues such as climate change. You have seen that now in Kenya, in some regions, we have had droughts. There's no rain, cattle dying. This is, of course, also with famine. There's hunger all over. These problems are glaring. Now, let me talk a little about opportunities. The public benefits of heritage are related to the value and significance that the public attaches to heritage. there are many different ways in which heritage benefits or values are perceived in society. The two main categories of heritage values are intrinsic values and instrumental values. This talks about how valuable or beneficial they may be to society. When we talk about intrinsic values or intrinsic benefits of heritage, we are talking, these are based on the idea that the heritage has an inherent value in itself, not merely as a means of acquiring something else. These kinds of benefits are not directly observable in forms such as pleasure, cognitive growth, or empathy. So those are intrinsic values or intrinsic benefits. On the other hand, we have instrumental values or instrumental benefits. These ones provide tangible benefits. They offer the means of achieving broad social and economic goals, such as economic growth, enhanced social capital, improvements in learning skills, health, water, and so on. I argue that although both types of benefits are important, instrumental values are the more relevant in the context of this research. Good examples of these kinds of values in the heritage sector is the heritage sector. This is a sector of activities on its own, which provides jobs and generates growth, providing direct impact, mainly economic effects of cultural heritage, not only in terms of archaeological resources, but also in other areas like agriculture, technology, tourism, and so on. So instrumental values are important because they can make tangible contributions to the people's lives. So those are opportunities. Time is going. Let me now talk about challenges. The challenges for Africa and Kenya in terms of the practice of archaeology are immense. These include the changing global knowledge economy and socioeconomic and political landscapes. These challenges can be confronted by dissemination of archaeological knowledge that allows for effective communication of the discipline. Challenges include funding. There's a major problem finding money for research nowadays is difficult, it's not easy. And this is mainly because Kenya, like many other Africans, is poor. Poverty among African societies and largely poor African economies provides an uncomfortable setting within archaeology. This naturally raises questions about how much financial priority should be afforded to archaeological research, which can even benefit local people. Other problems include lack of awareness about archaeology and the importance of heritage resources among people, the people who live near these sites, archaeological sites, for example, they may not know their value. So lack of awareness is a challenge. Many people may be unaware of their right to the enjoyment of their heritage resources, which is a human rights issue. Coupled with these are the inhospitable conditions prevailing in most parts of Africa, especially in our country, Kenya. In some places, we have security challenges. In some parts of Rift Valley, right now, you cannot research there because there's fighting. And then there are other problems. Due to time, I will not go, which include the legal and administrative framework. We do not have a specific law dealing with the cultural heritage impact assessment. This puts Kenya's cultural heritage at the mercy of opportunists, looters, and vandals who can manipulate administrative confusion. And this thing has even been raised by my colleague, David Kule. The laws lack clarity on how to promote multi-sectoral interests, etc., etc. So to conclude, if the right approach to the use of archaeological and other cultural heritage resources is applied, the values addressed in this paper can make a big difference to ordinary people's lives in this country. This calls for a values-based heritage conservation approach to the exploitation of archaeological resources. This approach aims at preserving the cultural significance of places by balancing the aesthetic, historic, scientific, spiritual, and social and economic values held by past, present, and future generations. This is an all-inclusive approach that benefits all. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you for a good presentation, an excellent presentation, because it moves from the traditional approach to a more post-modernism approach. And what we have seen is, Wafula has talked about many issues which are important to the growth of archaeology as a discipline, moving from the traditional approach. The traditional approach here being the way it has been probably up to the 90s, and the transformations that have taken place, and where we are at present, and has vouched for a value-based approach. And the value-based approach here is based on various approaches, and it is also based on the transformation of our economy up to the present, the Bill of Rights, and generally the Constitution, which also provides for the cultural rights for our communities. I think this is an important paper for our rethinking archaeology from the perspective of making it better and making the community directly involved. I think this would have also incorporated the bill that is in Parliament, or I think there's the Heritage Bill, which seems to cover some of the issues. There is also the issue of the decentralization of museums. I think museums are decentralized according to the Constitution. If you read the Constitution, you'll see that it has already been decentralized. The challenge has been, I think there are still wranglings, and I think this is because of the traditional approach to archaeology and heritage. And that is why there are still those challenges. Who will take the responsibility? And this comes about because of very little understanding of heritage, and particularly heritage in terms of all that we possess from the past. So there is a problem. How would you draw income out of it? And this is why most of the county governments have not legislated for museums as county as museums as part of county government responsibilities. And I think when we get there, some of the issues raised by Wafula will be dissipated, because the communities will be directly involved in the heritage that we see at county level. They will also be directly involved in what is displayed within the county, because it will be more elevating the heritage of the county. When the bill is passed, I think some of those issues will become more clearer, because instead of a centralized museum, there will be, I think there will be a body that is supposed to regulate museums that will already be in counties in terms of purely scientific element. Otherwise, the social element will be emphasized at county level. And I think that is very important. I think conservation issues are very important in a paper of this nature, because we also need to consider that scientific knowledge is critical to conservation of some of the materials. Some of them are materials that are fragile, particularly archaeological materials. I think the science element is quite important. But more important is the social element, and I'm happy with the presentation. Thank you. I think I want to open this ground for questions. I'll start with the audience here. We'll have to take 3 questions here. Then we'll pick 3 questions from the audience. And then we look at any comments that may have been made by the audience. Then we can come back. I think that's what we'll do. Otherwise, thank you for the presentation, Wafula. Thank you. Can we start? Yes, we are going to start with David Kule. Any other question? Can we have another question from the audience? Yes, Ben Nyanchoga, Dr. Ben Nyanchoga. Yes, there's a gentleman there. We'll also listen to him. Oh, sorry, it is Dr. Gona. You are hidden there. I couldn't see you. Sorry. Yeah. So we'll start the 3 with David Kule. But
thank you, Prof. and Chair of the session. And thank you, Gilbert, for a very good paper that is also well presented, and to Prof for a very informative discussion of the same. Now, I have several comments and questions that are rolled into one. To start with, perhaps you could comment on how we can motivate masses, or what we are calling ordinary citizens, to pay more attention to heritage, resources, exploitation, practice, and use. The second one is that Kenya's and Africa's cultural heritage is to a very large extent presented through a colonial prism. That is what you have just told us. Although you've told us that starting from the dawn of the current century, things started changing in the 1990s. How can we decolonize heritage? And because despite the Constitution having taken care of that, the realities and the practice of it is that it is still a colonial, heritage is still shrouded in that colonial prism. The other one is, and this is something that you didn't mention, although you alluded to it, intangible heritage. These are things like indigenous knowledge, religious practices, technologies, for example, the so-called witchcraft and such other sciences, are purely purposely ridiculed, discouraged, and even sometimes criminalized. What do you think can be done to normalize these things so that we don't, if we talk about the criminalization aspect of it, I think there is a colonial law which is still in the books about the criminal aspect of something like witchcraft. Yet in some other cases, we know that these are the things that can be done to achieve specifically what we are suggesting that we can be able to achieve in terms of practice, in terms of benefit, and so on and so forth. In what ways, for example, can we factorize, if there's such a word, cultural heritage? For example, manufacturing of materials that are based and derived from tangible heritage. For example, archaeological resources. If you go to the museum, there's a lot of material there. How can we turn that into things that somebody can put in a shop, shop in quotes, okay? How can we factorize indigenous medicines, for example, things that we know used to work, or agriculture? For example, in Tanzania, we have Ngoruka, we have, the Ngaruka irrigation systems. We have all these kinds of things, the so-called Sirikwa halls. In what way can we be able to use this information? When it comes to intangible heritage, we know a lot of application. For example, where I come from, we've got a lot of applications in terms of security. And yet, these are things that are criminalized. You don't just go stealing somebody's mangoes or chicken or something. I can tell you from personal observation that you go to somebody's shamba and you steal mangoes, instead of taking them away, you carry these mangoes to that person's home and you hang around until they release you. I think this is technology that we can be able to use, social cohesion, all right? Rainmakers in Western Kenya, but yet all these things are criminalized. And then there's also the challenge of, I think maybe not just the colonial thinking, but also the issues of foreign religions, especially religions that are associated with Christianity, whether you're talking about Anglicans, Catholics, and so on, Islam, basically the Abrahamic, shall I call them imperial religions. So then, in what way can we be able to overcome these challenges? You know, use history, use archaeology resources to be able to solve issues like, for example, what is happening in Eastern DRC.
Another question is how can we decolonize heritage? Most of the approaches which have been used are inherited from the Western kind of approach. We need to use new approaches, and especially I'm talking about the indigenous knowledge systems. In this approach, you use knowledge from the traditional knowledge, the traditional society where you are working. You have given us good examples of places like Ukambani, where there's a lot of traditional knowledge. So there are certain ways, certain methods in which you can acquire data, not using the Western approach, but the indigenous knowledge system. The indigenous knowledge systems is the way nowadays people are using to study African communities. So the indigenous systems knowledge is a good method we can use. Intangible heritage, our senior teacher, Professor Wandiba, we appreciate your advice. And the intangible heritage cannot be separated from the tangible heritage. They go hand in hand. And as Professor said, we can use intangible heritage to help us to interpret the archaeological heritage, which is tangible. So it has a role to play, but we can follow his advice on some of that intangible heritage that does not directly relate with us as archaeologists. I think you asked about the commodification of archaeological materials to make them commodities. I think that's what you meant. Yeah, that one is a bit challenging. We have to invent ways. That one, I'm also still thinking about it. It's not easy, my friend. Mwalimu Nyanchoga, archaeological heritage. I'll work on that one, given the comment also given by Professor Wandiba about redefining heritage and archaeological heritage. I'll work on that one. I was a bit in a hurry to writing, but I'll work on it. Who is the key player between academics and museums insofar as public community or there's contention about who is more concerned about
we see this amongst ourselves, or even the museum, which keeps on referring does that. Is it really known?
I feel that all of us archaeologists, whether you work at the museum or you are an academic, we are professional archaeologists. When we are working in the community, I think you have a role to do that. So we should not leave it to museum staff to do that role. Even we, as we are lecturers, but we interact with people. So if you are a professional archaeologist, it's my opinion that you'll also play a part in bring awareness to the public about these resources. So I don't think we should look at one part of archaeology and say you do it and we leave it to the other. Professor Dr. Gona, what is public? Public has been defined in many different ways. Some of these is an all-inclusive terms, but sometimes when I talk about local communities, I want to emphasize part of the public. So perhaps I should have emphasized that local communities, the public includes everybody. It will include the state, it will include ordinary citizens, it will include even school children. That's the public. But it's fair, really. I get your point. I need to emphasize which segment of the public I'm talking about. So I appreciate that comment, Dr. Gona. About the subalterns, how revolutionary? I'm still doing the research, but there are several ways in which I don't know what you mean by being revolutionary. It's not as if I need to carry guns. I can use activism in a way. So, but it's good you have alerted me on that one. I'll use some kind of activism to make this approach really effective. But I thank you very much, Dr. Gona, for that, those comments. Professor Wandiba, I really appreciate your comments. Professor Wandiba is my neighbor at home, and I'll get him so that he can advise me on what he has talked about. And Noreen, thank you very much for the encouragement. Noreen is a member of my family. She's my daughter. She's also a member of a student in the faculty. Thank you very much, my daughter. But generally, thank you, my colleagues. Yes. Thank you.
You probably can just stand there. Do we have any other question from this side? Yes, Margaret. Any other question? And Tabitha. I think we'll go with the two. And Margaret first, and then Tabitha. And then we'll go to the comments the chat, the comments in our chat, and anyone who has any comment online can also put their comment. Then we can go through them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bwana Wafula, for that very enlightening presentation. I just want to ask a very simple question from a laywoman's point of view. Now, I suppose the archaeological heritage you are talking about is a national resource. I could be wrong. And I'm just wondering if there's place for privatization of some of this heritage as a way to maybe circumvent or ameliorate some of the challenges you talked about. We are talking about neglect, for example. We are talking about plunder. We are talking about losing some of this heritage. Do you see any place for a private enterprise in your discussion? Thank you.
Yes, mine is just an observation first. I appreciate Mwalimu Wafula for such a wonderful presentation. Mine is just an observation that probably is that apart from just coming up with what Dr. Nyanchoga is proposing of museums of cultural heritage, I thought that probably there is need of coming up with what we call the children museums of cultural heritage that are in line with the school curricula that will enable the children to be able to embrace their culture from a younger age. And therefore, even when it comes to the adulthood, they will be able to be stakeholders, so they will be able to embrace and protect their heritage better. Again, probably just a question out of curiosity. I was wondering, do you think that changes in the traditional ways of life, that is the aspect of modernization, people have become so modernized in one way or another, have affected the way people value their cultural heritage?
We have a question online.
Yes, Professor.
We have any question online?
Professor.
Yes, we have Francis Owaka wants to ask a question. And
Yes.
with that, Wafula, after Owaka, there are those 3 questions here. What about the legal aspect? That is consultation archaeology. I think this is the archaeology that borders on privatization, where archaeologists go, do work, and then they are paid. I think that is what is being referred to here. So you can comment on that question. Then what is the future of archaeology in Kenya? That is, museums have remained the same over decades. I think the first one is on archaeology, like where there is construction and so on. I think you should address the 2. And then finally, I want to ask a simple one. I just wanted to know that I want to see where you place CBC education. We have those young minds. They are coming to us. You have mentioned all those problems. Where would you fit them in your scheme of things? Thank you. Thank you very much.
So do I ask my question?
Dr. Waka, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Congratulations, Dr. Wafula. That is enlightening, and I would like just you to share with us. You are dodging Dr. Gona's question on public knowledge. Kindly share with us how the public could benefit from knowledge of archaeology. One of the accusations with that has been labeled against archaeologists is that it is too elitist but too crude. Actually, when I joined the university, we used to call them grave diggers. I know Chule has experience of grave digging, and the impact of it on his life is known. Number 2, so you got it? Public participation and in the knowledge of archaeology. And 2, please comment on the impact on land use on the future of archaeology, especially in Kenya. I am looking at areas around South Sea which border the national park. I don't know of what archaeological value we have, but there is too much excavation. And in the last discussion we had from England, I think we benefited that archaeologists are consulted before any excavation is done. Kindly comment on that. The use of land use and the impact of this on future of archaeological activities and knowledge in Kenya. Thank you.
I think let me begin with Dr. Waka so that I don't forget. Dr. Waka, thank you. How the public would benefit from knowledge of archaeology. This requires, unlike in the past, when the approach of communicating archaeology used to be to use language that it's too complicated, that will put over archaeologists. Now, archaeologists realize that it is important that the way they present their work to the public is user-friendly, that it is simple, that the public can understand. Archaeologists have realized that their work will be useless unless they can be able to convey unless they can they communicate with the public. Therefore, it involves use of user-friendly approaches on impact on land use in archaeology. This one is an important issue. Our law, when I talked about challenges, I think I mentioned about weaknesses with our legal system, whereby we have not yet developed laws which can adequately protect our cultural heritage. They exist, but they are not adequate enough. For example, in countries where archaeology and where the public know about the importance of archaeological resources, where it's active, it is mandatory that when you make a development project in a place, for example, you want to build a road, you have to call archaeologists to come and survey to see if archaeological evidence or archaeological material are going to be destroyed before such a project is conducted. In Kenya, this usually happens, especially when that project is of international magnitude, so that international, or for example, donors require archaeologists to join the project and to write reports. But for us as Kenyans, that is not mandatory. That is why you can even see around this university, projects being done, foundations being laid, and you don't see us being required to come and investigate and see if something is going to be destroyed. So thank you very much, Dr. Owaka, for that question. Professor Home, on where we place CBC in this is a challenging question. I've never thought about it. Maybe something I need to think about, and maybe we as archaeologists in the department, we can sit and discuss and have something, because this is something which is we're going to be required as stakeholders in CBC. So I've not thought about it really. I have to be sincere, the professor. But I think as a department, archaeologists, we need to sit and discuss this issue so that we have something. Tabitha, it needs to come up with museums. That one is okay. Tabitha, I support you. That one is okay. Has modernization affected how people value their cultural heritage? I suppose so, because in the traditional setup, before the impact of westernization became very, very evident. I'm sure indigenous, or let me say traditional cultural traditions were very, very significant. But this one right now is one of the issues I think we should investigate when we go to local communities. It is something which we have to investigate, and this involves talking to the various people, the various local communities, so that we assess, we measure, and that's why it is one of the issues under investigation. Dr. Gachihi, a national resource, if there's a place for privatization, I think you are talking about private business in an archaeology. In countries such as the US, UK, Australia, Canada, most archaeologists are employed by private enterprises. They own businesses, they employ people. Why? Because laws are very strict. They need, archaeologists are very much on demand. And I remember the last visitor we had from Denmark alluded to that fact, that apart from public service, most archaeologists are employed in private sector. So in Kenya, one of the challenges which we have had is that so far we do not have laws. As Professor Home was saying, there's that bill which is being, I think is still in Parliament. Those are the things they're going to talk about, so that it gives room for private entrepreneurship. And that's going to be very important, because it's going to give opportunities for the citizens of Kenya. Private business is important. Of course, this will also include the efforts which you are trying to do to raise public awareness among Kenyans, so that they realize the importance of archaeology and these resources. Thank you. Who else? Our students. Abiba asked a question.
Yes, there are 3 questions. Can you go up? There are 3 questions. There are 3 questions. The first one, can you go up a little? The first one is from Habiba Bilal. What about the legal aspect? Other nations have carved out a niche for consultation archaeology, while we are still at the start line. If we can introduce a legal sector for the practice, is it coming from a government angle or a public one? I think that is related to what we are discussing, but you can answer that question. Then the second one is from Helen Mwaura. What is the future of archaeology in Kenya? Museums have remained the same over decades. How do we interest the younger generations and communities about archaeology and preservation of heritage? And Dr. Francis Owaka comes again and says, you see, donors require archaeological reports, meaning we are still wallowing in the miasma of colonial archaeology. When are we decolonizing it? Not in the future. I think you have been involved in some of those reports, Wafula, so you will explain that. Then Mohammed Ali Mwenje. Very nice discourse. I wonder if possible, you can assist us to unpack the definition of museums. Up to now, I have a feeling we have equated museums to archaeology, anthropology, and maybe natural history. Is it possible the spirit of the Constitution to devolve culture and museums also focuses on arts, as well as types of profitable museums that can be run by the private sector? I think with those questions, you can go ahead, and Ben will then give a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Some of them are very difficult. I may not be able to comment on almost everything, but Habiba, on legal aspects, I think I commented on that. Habiba is one of our 4th-year students. I think she's the one specializing. Thank you, Habiba, but I've commented on it when I was answering Dr. Gaishihi. Helen Mwaura, future of archaeology in Kenya. The future of archaeology in Kenya really it needs us to include the young generations. our students are our main source, the younger generations. So we are going to revamp our efforts, for example, in our department, to promote archaeology and to raise public awareness among archaeology. There are various strategies we are going to use, but we need to involve young people. And this is not only in the university, but even as my colleague Tabitha said, commented about museums of schools, so that they learn about cultural heritage, about archaeology, and so on. That one is a step in that direction. What else? I think that is what I can say. Thank you very much for giving me an ear and for sparing your time to come and listen to me. Asante sana.
I hope I'm being heard. Huh? Well, thank you very much. Happy New Year. Yeah, you know, this is a new year and we are all happy. First and foremost, I want to give an apology from our head of department. He was here initially and he was called on short notice to go and give a talk on Holocaust Museum. That is the information that is reaching us now. So he's not with us here, and we appreciate that. I want to appreciate our presenter this afternoon. It's going to evening. Mwalimu Gilbert Wafula Kitui. I don't know whether it's Gilbert Kitui Wafula. It's your father's name. You have given us a very good presentation. Wafula was my lecturer over the years. What I know about Wafula is that he is indeed a very, very good researcher. On research, he is superb. That's what I can say. He's a man of books. He reads very well and he keeps to himself most of the time, locking himself in his office and reading and reading. Very good in public archaeology. That's a fact. Thank you, Mwalimu, for that good presentation. We appreciate you. I want to appreciate our colleagues from the department, our friends, peers, and lovers of heritage who are here physically, and of course, those who are online. We don't take this for granted. You know, this year, we are even more blessed. We as archaeologists, I'm an archaeologist myself, I'm an archaeologist, and we want to say that it's a happy new year because we have started our series of seminars with a topic in archaeology. And we are happy about that. I really don't have much to say. And finally, or last but not least, I have to also appreciate the media persons who are here today. They have been doing a good job all through from last year. And we want to thank them for their efforts. I also want to thank Mwalimu Kiule for coming again back. I thought he had left forever, but I think coming back is a good sign that you are interested. So, Chairman of the session, Professor Wahome, thank you for taking us through this. Thank you very much. I think that's what I have to say.
Okay, thank you all.